All right, so thank you for inviting me to speak to you. We love the South Bay Lapidary Mineral Society because they are not only nearby, but have a lot of geology students that attend your annual mineral show. And most important, we're very appreciative that you've been giving money to the Wally Ford Scholarship for at least 20 years. And we've seen so many students get that scholarship. I'd say about 40 or 50. And there's several here tonight. And so it's always nice to associate face with a scholarship. So thank you very much for all that in the past, in the future. So tonight I want to talk to you about Antarctica, and because it's the place on the Earth that's most like another planet. It's like going to the planet Hoth in Star Wars, and it's really amazing. And for the last 10 years, I've had the pleasure of working for National Geographic and going down there during their summer, which is our winter. So I'll be leaving there for there in about a month. And then in the summer, I often work up in the Arctic, in the Iceland and Greenland. So you could say I'm bipolar, because I don't like the heat. Antarctica, I bet you've never seen it this way. Okay, if you take away all the ice, this is what it looks like. Okay, and so it is a whole series of mountain ranges and flat areas, as I will be talking about tonight, because this is the earth science of Antarctica. And the place I'm going to focus on is the peninsula. If everybody holds up your hand like this, and the Antarctica looks like that, and the peninsula's little finger sticking out. Right? That's where most people visit, because that's the area that you can get to, and it's not below freezing all the time. Okay. Here's another view of it without ice, but this is if you had melted the ice right away. As you probably have heard, most of the ice on the Earth is in Antarctica, about 80% of it. If it were to all melt, the sea level would rise about 200 feet and flood all of Florida and Louisiana and half of Texas. Some people like that idea, but it's not a good idea because it would also flood the New Yorks and the Londons and the Mumbai and Rio de Janeiro, all the really cool places on Earth. Okay? And so, well, what I want to point out here is the ice is really heavy. The ice is up to 2 miles thick. And so it's pressing down the continental crust. It's like when you sit on a bed and you press it down, and when you take it off, the bed springs up maybe within a few seconds. But in the case of continental crust, it can take tens of thousands of years. It's still springing up in Canada and Scandinavia where the ice was. Here's trivia. The Hudson Bay and the Baltic Sea are there. They're water because they were pressed down. They eventually will go away. Okay, so here's yet another view. And there's and you notice there's a really big mountain range in the middle that you probably never heard of, right? Yeah. And so when we say the ice is 2 miles thick, we don't mean necessarily above the peaks. It's over the most of it, shown in yellow. And other places you may have heard about are, there's a lake here that's actually liquid lake. It's salt water, and it's under the ice. And then this is the highest mountain range, and you can see, I'll be stressing this, the mountain range that goes all the way up here is like the Andes. It's really long, thousands of miles long, and it's created the same way as the Andes. Okay, so what do you first notice about Antarctica? Not a lot of rocks. Most of it is ice, and it's about 99% ice, and where the ice does come to the shore, you can see it creates these ice cliffs. So you can't even land and walk around, because it's an ice cliff, and they average about 100 feet thick, 100 feet high cliffs. So the rocks you do have are shared by humans and penguins. And so whenever you make a landing, there's usually penguins around. Right, so this is a simple geologic map of Antarctica. And the main part of Antarctica, the part that's your hand when you go like this, is mostly metamorphic rock. It's a craton, like Canada. You've heard of Canadian Shield, or maybe you've heard of Brazil with all its mineral wealth. That's another craton, another metamorphic shield area. And that's the big bulk of it. And if you go back several Pangeas ago, this continent used to be docked, used to be attached to California. So a lot of the rocks that you see in the San Gabriel Mountains and San Bernardino Mountains are similar to the same age and the same rocks as this bulky part of Antarctica. The part that's most interesting and the part that's most visited and most of the research stations are on is this mountain range that I pointed out earlier, which actually consists of two mountain ranges. Okay? And most people don't know this because this one's under ice. Okay? And this is the one more photographed, more visited. And this one is active, as I will be talking about. It's like the Andes. It has mountain building, it has volcanoes and everything. And this is an older one, closer to, let's say, the Appalachian Mountains in its formation and age. Okay. And then this is one last map of the whole continent. And you can, in this, if you put everything I've just said together, now we've added back to the ice, and you can still see there are some outcrops around here of metamorphic rock, and there's the older mountain range through here. And then this one, though, the Andes type one, is almost entirely covered with ice. It's only when you get out to the peninsula, where most of these pictures are taken, and my visits have been, that you see the exposures. So most of what I'm going to be talking about is the volcanism and the granites out here in this end. Okay, so speaking of that end, the Antarctic Peninsula, this is what a detailed geologic map looks like. Each color represents a different type of rock, not a mineral and not a rock name, but a type of rock, like volcanic rock or intrusive granite rocks or sedimentary rocks, these major groupings. So as you may or may not be able to read, the green, the whatever that is, those are volcanics, this yellow-green color. And the intrusive granite type rocks are these red ones, shown in red, but not really red, which is on this map. And sedimentary rocks, though, are quite interesting. They're down here, and you may say, oh, there's lots of them, you could go visit them. No, you can't. Really, the edge of where you can visit is about here, without having an icebreaker. And most all the research stations are on this side. So very, very little sedimentary rocks for anybody to visit, whether they're going to a research station or a cruise or anything. And then the exception is up here, shown in this purple color. There's sedimentary rocks there, and out here, where there's famous fossil locality is out here. But here again, it's really hard to get to because the edge of the ice is usually right about here. And so you can't go south of that line because it's all frozen. And you can't go south of that line. So we're very limited, and that's why it makes it like another planet, right? It's really hard to get to see the places you. Okay, now we're going to zoom out plate tectonics. We always usually like to start with plate tectonics, but this talk is the exception. And the Antarctic Plate is the one that we tend to ignore. In fact, a lot of students forget to put it on a test or in their reports. But as you can see, Antarctica is here in the middle, and Antarctica, the continent, only makes up about 1/4, 1/5 of the whole plate. But the other thing about this plate that makes it different from other plates on Earth, it's totally surrounded by red, these red areas. And these red areas are the divergent rift valleys. And they're almost all entirely under ocean. So this part's down in the South Pacific, this part is in the East Indian Ocean, et cetera, et cetera. So the plate's getting larger because things are pulling apart about 1 inch a year on either side. So Antarctic Plate is getting wider about 2 inches a year. So shall we alert the media? So the exception is right here. There's a subduction zone that I think it's one of the biggest mistakes in all geology textbooks and oceanography textbooks. They tend to forget this. So I'm going to write letters to all the authors and say, you're forgetting there's a little subduction zone off of Antarctica. Antarctica used to be part of Pangaea along with almost all the other continents, and it used to be attached down here to South America, Africa, India, Australia. And this is a pretty famous area in studies of fossils and evolution. It's called Gondwanaland. But you can see Antarctica fits in like a jigsaw puzzle really well between Australia, which is now a desert, India, which is now hot and with a billion people, and Africa, which is desert, and South America. So the climates they have now definitely was not the case back then. And speaking of fossils, Antarctica has been studied along with the other continents, but Antarctica is really hard to find fossils. I'm going to show you some fossils. One of the few places is what I was telling you around the bend of that peninsula is where you can find them. But we know from these fossils that where it fit and how these fossils, like the green one, is a plant fossil. And the brown one is a land reptile. And because they're land reptiles, they can't swim from one continent to another, so we know these continents were attached. So the same fossils you find in southern India are the ones you find out in eastern Antarctica, etc. So it's sort of a fun jigsaw puzzle. Okay, so what happened? Okay, there were two big breakups. Okay, and the first one is when India and Africa, so what we call the West Indian Ocean, formed about 130 million, plus or minus 10 million, who cares, right? And that's this breakup here that's really shown here with different ages of oceanic crust. Same with Madagascar broke up. And so India broke apart and Africa broke, so the big split was here. So that was what you might call part one. And then part two were these over here, Australia, New Zealand, and Antarctica over here broke up. So you can see that's just beginning to happen in this diagram. This diagram is from about 100 million years ago. So two big breakups. So any fossils after 100 million years would start showing divergence. You wouldn't have the same land fossils in Australia as you do in Antarctica. Okay, it's story time. Okay, all right. And my first trip down to Antarctica, I was pleased to share it with Buzz Aldrin. We were two of the guest speakers on board. And I don't know if you know who Buzz Aldrin is, but he's most famous for having a cartoon character named after him. Buzz Lightyear, okay, from Toy Story, but I'm kidding. He's really famous for being the second person to step on the moon. He stepped on the moon like 5 minutes after Neil Armstrong. And so I got to work with him, and I have to tell you a fun story. We get on, when we're flying down there, it takes a lot of flights. You have to fly down to Buenos Aires, then you have to fly down to Ushuaia, and then you got to get on the bus to go to the ship, etc. And when we're on the bus, I introduced myself to him. We were talking in the front row, and he said to me, "How far away is the moon from the Earth?" And I looked at him and I said, "You're the rocket scientist." Because he is. He has a PhD in rocket science. So it's going to be on my grade, but I got to tell Buzz Aldrin, "You're the rocket scientist." So fortunately, I knew the answer. So, and the reason he needed it, he had to give it in his introductory talk that evening. So he needed it like right then. So, anyway, sorry, fun story about Buzz. Okay, volcanic rocks. All right, volcanic rocks. We're really familiar with them in California. Almost every rock between Victorville and Las Vegas is volcanic rock, so we're really familiar with them. But they have them down there mostly because of that subduction zone that I made a big deal about 5 minutes ago. All right, and they have volcanoes. A lot of people don't understand that. They may know that Iceland has volcanoes, but Antarctica has volcanoes because of that little subduction zone that's not mentioned in geology books. Okay, and so whenever you have a yellow layer like that, it's usually an ash layer, and it's been weathered to yellow. And if you have a flat black layer, it's usually basalt. In this case, it's a cap rock, just like you have it out in the Mojave Desert, with the black basalt. It makes a really nice hard cap rock. And even during glaciations, when this was covered up with ice during the last ice age, it couldn't erode through that hard rock. And then if you have a jumble like this, it might be more complicated. It might be a remnant of a volcano itself or a cinder cone. So the same skills you can use out in the California desert, same colors, identification, and layers versus jumbled, you can use in Antarctica. Okay, and as I mentioned before, it's a subduction zone. So here's a 1 minute introduction to subduction zone. Most subduction zones in the world are where the oceanic crust, which is almost all below the ocean, usually about 3 miles deep, it subducts, it bends down at somewhere 30, 40, 50 degree angle, and it actually dives underneath the continent. In the process, when it gets to be about 100 miles deep, it causes melting here, and magma comes up. And that magma can come out as any kind of lava. It can be high silica or low silica. And so you have a chain. Famous subduction zone volcano chains are places all around the Pacific Ocean, basically. This Pacific Rim, the Ring of Fire. So you're all supposed to start singing the Johnny Cash song now. Ready? Okay. All right, so anyway, a ring of fire is not really fire, it's a ring of magma and lava. Okay, this is what it looks like on a map, but this is the Pangea or Guanalan all put together. And so you can see that this started before the breakup happened, right? And it's been going on, most of it happened, as it did in California, most of it happened during the Mesozoic, the dinosaur times. So same with us, our granites are almost all about 100 million years old. The same here, a little younger, closer to 90 million years old. But you can see that you would find the subduction zones going north. The subduction zone in the ocean was out here, and it was diving underneath to the, not north, I should say up. Okay, can't use north and south when you're dealing with Antarctica. All right, so you can still see it. If you go to Antarctica, about half the people go to Antarctica get to do this amazing experience where you get to cruise into a caldera. And it's one of the 4 calderas I love to talk about because they're all the same size. 6 miles across. The most famous caldera in Oregon is Crater Lake, 6 miles across. Right? The most famous caldera in Europe is Santorini, 6 miles across. My favorite place in Greece, by far. Okay, and the one in Antarctica is Deception Island, 6 miles across. And just like Santorini, you can cruise right in through this little narrow entrance. Makes for a really good bay. All right, so you can see that it looks much like Santorini or Crater Lake. All right, anytime you have yellow rocks in these volcanic areas, there's usually volcanic ash, and what it weathers to, when we say weather, it means it changed chemically. And basically it's rotting and changing into what we call palagonite. And it creates the yellow color that you often see in Iceland or in Antarctica. Very common in basalt areas and ash areas. This is the entrance of Deception Island, and you can see there's a lot of red. And it's the same as out in the Mojave Desert or Arizona. Anytime you see red rock, there's a very, very good chance it's cinders, right? And the same kind of cinders you find in your garden or in your barbecue grill or something like that. And then from Cinder Cone, this one is a pretty recent one, so you could almost make out the shape of the Cinder Cone. But most of them are highly eroded because of the ice. And so you just see a splash of red here and a splash of red there. You don't see the beautiful cinder cones like you see in southwest United States. So this one has all 3 colors. You have black cinders, you have red cinders, and you have palagonite layers over here. Okay, and there's even, if you have a good depth finder, you know, sonar, you can make out craters inside craters. So you could, if you're inside Deception Island, caldera, or there's another half caldera called Half Moon Bay Island, you can actually make out craters that are underneath the water. And if you had got out, walked over the ice, you could also make some out under ice. All right, this is my fun story. So this is again story time. Okay, I'll give you a break from all the geology. The last 2 times I've been down there, we went out to the very end of the peninsula, you know that thing. And way out the end, there's a whole bunch of islands, and each one of these islands is amazing. They have 200,000 penguins on each of these islands. And that's what most people are looking at. And they're all looking up, oh my God, you know, but as we approach, this is on a zodiac. We move around the zodiac. And what I look at is the rocks. Everybody else is looking up at the penguins. I'm looking at the rock because this is cool. None of this rock exists in Wikipedia or any easy to find source. So I was identifying the rocks at every one of these islands I've been to over the last several years, and I would put it on Wikipedia and other sources so that people would know what these rocks are, and that's why they exist. Granite is one of the hardest rocks. You know, if you're going to make a gravestone, it's going to last forever. You make it out of granite, right? And so these are way out at the peninsula, and they are the most resistant. And they all tend to be circular, and I think they're granite croutons. They're eroded granite croutons. They tend to be flat because the ice eroded off the top, but the sea waves have eroded all around. So anyway, this is me touching an island that maybe no geologist has ever been to. There's no record. We just have to say maybe. If there was a geologist in this area, they would be heading to the sedimentary rocks around the bend because of the fossils. But also, these are hard to get to, usually very big lakes. There's also metamorphic rocks, as I mentioned, in that mountain range that resembles the Andes, and particularly that one you can't really get to further inland. There are metamorphic rocks, and these are they're very common. They make up the big bulk of Antarctica, but that's not really accessible. That's not where my talk's really on, because I've never been to the big bulk of what we call East Antarctica. But they've got them. It's just almost all under ice. And as I've been saying all along, there are sedimentary rocks, and we can access them. Those are the ones out at the end of the peninsula. But there again, 99% of Antarctica is covered with ice. You've got to go where there's no ice, and it's usually either too steep or too inaccessible. In this case, it's too steep for the ice to stick to it, so that's why you're seeing them. Well, oh wow, you know. So what's the big trait of sedimentary rocks? Horizontal layers, or at least layers, parallel layers. So they do have coal deposits in Antarctica. They have sandstone, they have shale, they've got limestone, because the climate used to be warmer. As we saw in that fossil diagram, they used to have reptiles there. You can't have reptiles if it's really cold. And so here's some of the fossils that I found on one of my, I think people ask me, what was the most thrilling thing you ever did down there? And they think I'm going to talk about the whales or the sea lions or the penguins. I'm like, no. It was, I got to lead a hike, a couple miles long hike, out at Seymour Island, and I was the first person possibly ever to walk in this area, because we were walking in where it wasn't charted. And these fossils were sitting on the snow. And then you can imagine I'm going crazy. I'm like, ah! And then you're not allowed to take anything. Antarctica is like a big national park, like Galapagos Island. So you're not allowed to take anything. So I laid them all out, and I for anybody to see in the future, I guess, I don't know, until the next snowfall. But you can make out an ammonite on the right side. I think it's a conical coral on the left. So who cares? Well, penguins care because they can only go on shore where there's rocks, right? And why? Because they have to build their nest. They make them out of little tiny pebbles, and they all steal each other's pebbles and everything. But they need rocks. But we need it if we're gonna know about the Earth. And there's one other reason. The beaches that you land on there, there's no sand. There's no mud flats. It's all gravel because when you have really big waves like they have there most of the year, it's going to give you pebble beaches. So I'm going to be there in November, December for 5 weeks. I'm not going to see a sand on the beach for 5 weeks. And when you look down at some of the pebbles, they look just like eggs. They look like quail eggs. So it's sort of fun that people, I get one in my email and go, look, I found an egg. People, is that a penguin egg? Penguin eggs are white and they're much larger. So anyway, this is a pebble. I wasn't supposed to bring it back, but I brought it back for educational purposes. Yeah. Oh, actually, if the customs inspector had stopped me, I'd just tell him it's a quail egg.
Dropped it.
Okay, so here's a cool thing. This is the only mineral that was named after a continent, and it's called Antarcticite, and it's calcium chloride, and we happen to have probably the only sample in LA here tonight, thanks to one of your members, John Emite. He brought it by tonight. He couldn't make it here, and so he brought me the sample. But it's not here. Where do you think I'm storing it? It's only found in Antarctica and other cold places. I got the cooler. Between the ice and the blue ice. Why do we have to do it? It's a calcium chloride and it has a lot of water, 6 molecules of water for every ion of chlorine or calcium, and it loves to absorb water. And it's a mush. Actually, it's dissolved at room temperature. So here it is, and it's solid, and it's forming trigonal planar crystals, and it is found in California. If you go out to Bristol Lake in the winter, okay, and you break through the ice, so you got to be there when it's under below freezing, just like in my cooler here, and you can actually find it on the bottom. So why is it's only found in really cold? Is because it just likes to dissolve, and so the only way you see it in a solid form is if it's really cold, and that's why it was discovered in Antarctica. Not the peninsula, but the really cold mainland part of Antarctica. Okay. Here's another story, all right? So here's my friends on Half Moon Island. It's another caldera, and something unusual happened there. I led one of the longest hikes I ever had, and I was inland, and we started goofing around. You gotta goof around when you're around snow, right? And so people were sliding down a hill, and I realized it was really unsafe because every other person had hiking sticks, and so I didn't want anybody to get their eye poked out in the middle of nowhere when you're 1 week away from being evacuated. And so I was so busy trying to stop people, I didn't notice till later on what happened is I lost my cell phone in the middle of Half Moon Island. So if any of you are down there, the next year I found out somebody found the cell phone. So if you get a phone call, if any of you are on my speed dial and all you hear is a bunch of squawks or you know who's making the phone call. It freezes on the surface about 6 feet thick, maybe something like in that order, 9 feet thick, 2 or 3 meters thick, and you'll see the Antarctica becomes much larger there, but it doesn't freeze solid. A lot of people have that misconception. Antarctica is isolated from the rest of the world, so it's essentially its own ecosystem. It's like a different planet, and a lot of people view that ocean around what you might call the Antarctic Ocean is called the Southern Ocean, and a lot of marine biology books. And here's a view of it from on a map, and it's basically the dashed line separates the Antarctic, the Southern Ocean, from the rest of the world. So Here's the difference between the Arctic and the Antarctic. The Arctic is a bunch of land surrounding a cold ocean, and the Antarctic is a bunch of water, a bunch of ocean surrounding cold land. And that's why Antarctica is the coldest place on Earth by far. Much colder. It's also the windiest place on Earth. Why? Because there's no trees to slow it down, and the topography is mostly just smooth ice, so it's the windiest place on Earth. And that's on land. There's no obstacles, but even out at sea, you can see here that the windiest place on Earth is the southern oceans. Why? Because there's no continent blocking it. The wind just keeps whipping around, from west to east, and it's just a very, very windy place. Okay, and as a result, it's the waviest place in the world. And if you know anybody to Antarctica, who's gone to Antarctica, you know the number one issue is, can you handle the waves on the way down and the way back? It's not so bad usually about 1/3 of the time, and about 1/3 times medium, but 1/3 of the time it's like, whoa, you gotta hold on to your plate, and you gotta hold on to ropes as you're walking through the ship. So, and why? Because the wave heights are so big here, on average, this is averaged out over a year, humongous waves. And this is where most people go to Antarctica, go to the peninsula, which looks funny on this Mercator map. This is the part of the ocean, the Drake Passage, that you have to pass. This is an interesting diagram. I added because it's December. What season is it here in the northern hemisphere? In December, it's winter. All right, so we have all these big storms. This is why we have monster waves coming in California and the whole west coast during the winter. So what season is it in Antarctica? Summer. You think, oh, they don't have big waves. Wrong. Look at it. The storms are just as big during their summer as during our winter. Why? Because here again, you have this big, expansive ocean with no continents blocking the way, so the waves can get going really big. The storms can get really big. So in the summer, you can have these monster wave heights. Measured here, the red in the center of the storm is like 25, 20 to 30 feet high. Just to mention, wind chill is all that matters. People say, what temperature is it? I say, it doesn't matter. It's all about wind chill. It could be 40 degrees, but if the wind's blowing 30 miles an hour, you're going to be really, really cold, right? And the wind, the highest wind I've ever experienced in my life is 60 miles an hour. Sustained, gusts up to 90 and down there. And it's, you can't be outside when you have that kind of wind chill. Okay, more story time, okay? All right, sometimes there's wildlife, sometimes you run across it on land when you're not looking for fossils, okay? And sometimes when you're driving a Zodiac, this is me driving a Zodiac, that's the National Geographic Explorer in the background, and you're not likely to find any wildlife when you're up on the ice, but there I am with my walkie-talkie just in case I spot any wildlife, and then it happened. Okay, the last time I was down there, a penguin jumped in my boat to escape from a leopard seal. And I was like, well, hello! And you're not supposed to touch any of the wildlife, so you just sort of wait and look at it and wait for it to jump back in the water. Pretty cool. Pretty cool experience. As you heard, 99% of Antarctica is covered with ice. That's what it's most famous for, and deservedly so. I already mentioned the big high sea cliffs. Okay. The Antarctica can double in size during the winter. This is at the end of their winter. Okay, it's our fall, but it's their spring. Right, and this is at the end of their summer. Okay, so if you want to go there with the least amount of ice blocking your way, and you want to go in as far south as you can, you got to go in February. So if, like I mentioned, that to get those fossils are right here on the yellow line, that's the edge of the ice. Or if you want to go see sedimentary rocks down here, you gotta go all the way down there. But you can't get beyond those two areas. So almost everybody who visits Antarctica visits on that, what you call the west coast of the West Peninsula. Okay, and when the ice does freeze, as I mentioned, it's about 6 feet, maybe in certain areas up to 9 feet thick. This is called fast ice. Fast doesn't mean it's rapid. It's the old meaning to hold fast means to hold tight. And so it's connected to the land. And when it's breaking up, especially in February or so, you can actually ram your ship into it. And you don't do this in November or December, okay? And then you can walk around the ice. So in this case, it was hard enough to walk on, but soft enough to ram the ship in. And the ships that are down there usually have ice-hardened hulls, so they're used to doing this. So you don't have to worry. However, it's a little disconcerting. You're sitting there eating lunch and suddenly, there's no other industry where you have that experience and you go, oh, it's okay. We do this all the time. It's only a 6.0. Yeah. All right, then it breaks apart all throughout the whole their summer. It breaks apart, and it doesn't just melt from the top down, it breaks up into segments. And so this is the view from the ship looking out when you're in it. And it doesn't matter what month you're there, you always have some sort of pack ice, breaks up into packs. And I'm going to skip this complicated diagram so I can talk about what's really cool. And then I've already mentioned that the ice cap gets really, really thick here. It's in miles thick, okay? And where it's shown in purple is the thickest part. And so, on top of everything else, Antarctica has like a dome of ice over it. And so it's not like a bowl of ice cream. It's more like a bowl of ice cream where the ice cream sort of melted down and then you refreeze it. You know? So it's almost a perfect dome. So basically featureless. It's really boring. If you're seeing a picture of South Pole, it's really boring. But over on the peninsula, it's much thinner, and as you can tell on the scale here, it's much, much thinner, and so we have a lot of rocks sticking up out of it. This is a really cool diagram. This shows how fast the ice is moving. This is the other definition of fast. This means rapid, how rapid it is. And what do you notice? It's not moving fast at all in the middle, where it's shown here in the yellows and the pinks. Where the fastest is, the most rapid, is these areas here, and where there's these ice shelves. And it's where the ice is pouring out. So it's just like a river, if you can imagine, but it's a slow motion river. And it's pouring out, and the highest speeds are at the end of the rivers, or they look like deltas or estuaries, but these are actually ice, 1,000 feet thick, the shelves here. There's this one I'm going to mention later on at the Larsen Shelf, then there's the Ross Sea Shelf, and then there's this really big one over here. And it's these ones that we're most afraid of with global climate change. If these start to break apart, then it's going to let loose the ice that's held back here. Like this one we're really worried about, because if this breaks apart and starts forming a bay back here, it could let loose. Remember, the ice here is 2 miles thick. That's what we're most afraid of in Antarctica. The prediction is East Antarctica is not going to melt, but West Antarctica is the one we have to keep our eyes on, and we're doing all the research on, because they do have ice shelves breaking up there. Where the ice pours out of the ice cap, you have valley glaciers, just like you have in the Rocky Mountains or in the Cascades. And here they come down to the sea, and they form cliffs about 100 feet high, and they break to form icebergs. Then we have calving icebergs. These are calving icebergs are when the ice falls off. Remember, these cliffs are about 100 feet, maybe 200 feet high, and these chunks of ice fall off. I'm sure you've seen all these online and in movies and on TV, because this is the big image we use for global climate change. As these glaciers break up, they calve a lot. And when they do, they create big waves, and you actually have to watch yourself. When this was happening, I was actually over the radio, I was hearing say, "Joe, get everybody off the beach." And I said back, I said, "The penguins know what to do." And they said, "No, the humans." I'm only kidding. I guess you're not supposed to kid when there's an emergency, like a tsunami coming toward you. So anyway, you do have to evacuate the beach. Okay, and as you probably know, icebergs, you're just seeing the tip of the iceberg above the water, and it's usually about 90%, but depending on the salinity, it can be in the 80s. Okay, And then I mentioned a few minutes ago the shelf ice. It's unique. Only in Antarctica do you have it. And this is why I said Antarctica is like going to another planet. And this is a perfect example. There's no other place on Earth that's like this. You have this ice pouring out onto the shelves. These are bays. They're huge. They're seas, I should say, the big seas. That would be a bay. And this is a big sea. And, you know, like Baltic Sea and Hudson Bay kind of thing. But they're covered with this 1,000-foot thick ice. And it's moving towards the ocean, as I mentioned before. And this is a schematic of what happens, is that the calving, when they break off, they don't fall into the sea. It's 1,000 feet thick. That's a 100-story tall building thick. And they break off into these big chunks. They're basically the largest moving objects on Earth. These are called tabular icebergs. And if you want to see them, you gotta go to Antarctica. And when I'm talking to people about going to Antarctica, you can go on big ships, you can go on small ships. Big ships, you know, like Celebrity Cruise or Norwegian, go there. And they say, but we can't stop on land. I go, but you can see a tabular iceberg. It's the only place on Earth. There are things you can see, even from a large cruise ship. So this is what the shelf would look like, but there again, that could be an iceberg. These icebergs are over 100 miles wide, so you can't tell if this is what you're looking at here. But from a satellite, you can tell. If it's surrounded by water, it's probably an iceberg that's moving. Okay, if it's not surrounded by water, it's probably the ice shelf, and you can see this is ice shelf with some crevasses in it. And the ice shelf I mentioned earlier, the Larsen one, it's up on the east side of the peninsula. It's the one most studied ice shelf in the world because it started to break up. It has a section A, B, and C. Each one is huge, much bigger than any bay on the west coast of the United States. And each shelf has been breaking in sequence, like one every decade. But C, Larsen C, was studied because there's a lot of research stations, including the one I've been to, which is the Palmer Research Station. They are studying this. And you can see when it breaks up, huge chunks come off. And here's an iceberg the size of Delaware, okay, the size of a state that's breaking up. And they don't break up overnight, you know, it's 1,000 feet thick, it's breaking off. It's sort of like an aircraft carrier pulling away from a dock without an engine. It just has to go with currents. All right, here's more about the breakup of the Larsen ice shelf and the one big iceberg. It took 3 years to melt. And it was really interesting because I kept going back every year and I'd say, so where's the iceberg? The iceberg. And I would say, oh, it's about 100 miles away. And next year they go, oh, it's too far away. It's about 200 miles away. You can't see it anymore. So that's how big it is, the size of a state. Okay, and this is what it looks like. Most of them, they're not that big. Most are the size of towns. I'd point out one, that's the size of a city. And then sometimes you see one in the background, that's the size of a county. People are saying, what are you doing? And there's nothing else that on Earth that moves that is on the size of a city, county, or state. It's pretty amazing. Okay, and it can be really beautiful as they melt. This is multi-year. After 3 or 4 or 5 years, they start creating these really cool. My favorite thing to photograph every year is sea arches. And I see them every year, and they're always from these tabular icebergs that are, it's probably where a crevasse used to be, and it was a zone of weakness, and so it formed an arch. Antarctica is an amazing place for wildlife. It's famous for penguins and leopard seals and killer whales and whales. And it's amazing for its ice. And a lot of people want to go there because it's the 7th continent. But I think my reason I like to go there every year is because it's the most amazing place. You learn more per day than you do anywhere else in life because it's most like another planet. It's really an interesting thing. And so there are affordable ways to go. You can go on a big ship, and you just can't get off. You get off when you're in the Falklands and in the Chilean fjords. But in Antarctica, because it's a national park, they don't allow you off. but you can still see tabular iceberg, you can still see arches, you can still look over and see pelagonite cliffs. Maybe the ship will go in and you can see Deception Island. If you can afford a little more, you can go on the more expensive cruises that cost like 8 times more, and there you can walk around and everything. So my hope is everybody thinks about going, earth sciencey kind of people. It's really an amazing thing. So anyway, that's my plug for middle class travel to Antarctica. So thank you very much.